All right. Hi, everyone. Hope we're all doing well. Today is the second installment on our section on a right to health care. So, Papadimos is going to give us an argument for why there is a basic human right to health care. Okay, so recall that we made a distinction last time between positive rights and negative rights. So, positive rights are those rights in which uh, people are obligated to give the rights holder something, right? So if I have a right in virtue of a contract, if I have a right to some of your income, right, some percentage, then I will receive that. That's a positive right. You have to do something for me. But we also, by contrast, have negative rights, which means that um, everyone else is only obligated to refrain from doing certain things to me. So if the right to life is negative, that just means that people can't, throw an axe at my face and they can't do things that would kill me, right? But that doesn't mean necessarily that they have to save my life if I'm in a predicament. That only means that they have to refrain from certain actions towards me. Recall also that ought implies can. And so if we have a right, then there's a corresponding obligation. And in order for there to be an obligation, we must be able to fulfill that obligation, right? So one thing is that that Baumrin argued last time is that um, if there is a right to health care, it's way too demanding and we can't actually fulfill it. So that means that it can't be a right because ought implies can and we cannot. So that's the kind of structure of his criticisms of a positive right to health care. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Papadimos. So his arguments are, somewhat interesting, right? So they may not be just the best arguments for why we have a right to health care, but the interesting thing that this paper shows us, or at least claims to show us, is that um, health care as a right is a product of Western thought, right? So Aristotle, Hobbes, and Locke, and Rousseau, and all of these guys point us in the direction to a right to health care. And that's an interesting conclusion. It doesn't show us that we do in fact have a right to health care. Rather, it shows us that thinking that there is a right to health care is consistent with the history of Western thought and Western philosophy. Okay, so let's think about, um, we talked earlier about identities in this semester. So we have the atomistic and the relational conceptions of self, right? So in Western thought, there tends to be this pull towards the atomistic conception of self, right? You are yourself isolated from everybody else in this very distinct way, and you are who you are in virtue of having certain capacities that only you have, and then other people also have, right? But it's not like they're connected in any sort of meaningful way, right? So I have a soul, and so that's what makes me who I am over time, right? I have the ability to reason. That's what makes me who I am over time. I have my own memories, right? And so that's what makes me who I am over time. All of these conceptions isolate ourselves. Whereas, as we talked about in the Bryson piece, that the relational conception of self is that your identity is constitutive of a number of relationships and roles that you enter into, right? So if we have an atomistic conception of self, then it seems like we wouldn't have the right to healthcare, just kind of at first glance. Whereas if we have a relational conception of self, it seems like we would have the right to healthcare, right? Because people may owe, in virtue of being in a relationship with someone, they may owe us like certain level of healthcare, right? Whereas the atomistic conception is just like super isolated. So the interesting thing here is that even though Western thought has moved in this atomistic conception of who we are and what we are, they have nonetheless, figures in the West have nonetheless point us to the conclusion that there is a right to health care. Okay, so we kind of get this like little discussion at the very beginning of the article about why health is valuable, right? And so it's health is valuable, but like, why do you want to be healthy, right? So there's two reasons. First of all, health is sufficient for life, right? Or at least is necessary for life. And so if you can't, or if you have really bad health, then you'll die, right? And so our continued biological existence is contingent on a certain degree or sufficient level of health. The second thing, and this is kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit more, is that a higher degree of health is sufficient for a good life. So, for instance, if the good life is defined as having relationships and projects and commitments, right? I have to be in a healthy and well enough state of mind to do all of those things, right? That assumes that I'm like able-bodied, right? If part of living a good life is being able to have friendships, say, then I have to be well enough to go out and create friendships. Whereas if I'm like bedridden, then I'm going to miss out on that element of the good life. So health is valuable insofar as it continues our lives, right? And insofar as it moves us towards the good life. Okay, so the first argument for why there's a right to health care comes from Aristotle. So premise one, Aristotle thinks that the soul and the body are distinct things, right? So we have a body, and then we also have a soul. Premise two, the soul is the realized potential of the body. And so the body is merely an instrument of helping us realize the soul, right? So when we have perfected our body to whatever degree, right, or our mind to whatever degree, we realize that we realize our soul, right? The soul, premise three, is to be grown and nurtured towards a life of intelligence and character actively functioning, right? So the idea here is that if you remember back to virtue ethics, part of what humans are for, part of the function of humans is to live in accordance with the virtues. And that's how we characterize or sort of optimize what it is that we are, right? That's like our function. So remember that the hammer has the function of hammering because it has all the right characteristics. Whereas like a cell phone doesn't have, isn't a good hammer, doesn't have the function of hammering because it lacks all of those characteristics. So the virtues, intellectual and character virtues, are all like necessary for us to realize our life, right? To realize our soul. Okay, so the soul, premise four, can only grow and develop if the body is cared for and nurtured, right? So if we're going to demonstrate the virtues, both character virtues and intellectual virtues, then we have to have some degree of health, right? We can't be bedridden all day. We can't be virtuous if we're bedridden all day. I mean, maybe in many cases, right? But still, it helps us to be virtuous to have a sufficient degree of health. Premise five, since we can't reach the final end of the soul, which is virtue, without the body being cared for and nurtured, we have a fundamental interest in our health being protected, right? So we all have an interest, meaning a conscious preference, to have a functioning and healthy body, right? So that we can be virtuous. And so it follows from that, somehow it follows from that there's a general right to health care, right? So given that we have an interest in health, follows that there is a right to health care according to this very interesting Aristotelian picture, right? So you might be thinking, well, I don't believe in a soul, right? I'm like a reductive materialist. That's okay, right? What this argument is trying to get us towards is that Aristotle himself, right, a major figure in Western philosophy, sort of had all of the ingredients for a right to healthcare, right? And so even though you don't buy an Aristotelian picture of the way that reality works, you can see that within that picture, there's a right to healthcare there. And that's very interesting. So we also talked about Kant. So Kant wants to say that we all have absolute moral worth or dignity that must be respected simply because we're capable of rational thought, right? So recall that he thinks that Human beings are ends in themselves, right? They're never to be treated as a mere means to some end, but rather as an end in themselves, the formula of humanity, right? So, and we have that value and virtue of being um, rational in the way that Kant talks about. So the capability or capacity of rational thought requires some degree of health, right? So if we're thinking about rational agency, about creating ends for ourselves and then meeting those ends, right, we have to be in a position to actually carry out those ends that we set for ourselves, right? And that requires that we have a functioning body that can sort of take care of itself, that can meet all of these ends. And in order to have a functioning body like that, we have to have a certain degree or level of health. Three, since our ability to continue living and exercising our rational capacity requires a particular level of healthcare, then this level of healthcare should be protected as a way of respecting humanity or human dignity, right? So we want people to have rational agency. They can have rational agency only if they have some degree of health, right? And so given that rational agency requires health, right? We respect people in virtue of promoting their health, right? And so it follows from that there is a general right to health care, right? So what's valuable here is not necessarily health, but it's the capacity of rational thought and rational agency. And we get that only if we promote health, right? So it's similar to the other one. What matters is the soul, really, but we can't get to that thing without health. And so we need to promote it by way of a healthcare right, right? So once again, even if you're not a deontologist, right, it's interesting to see that there's sort of this movement in Western thinking towards right to healthcare. Now, I mean, Kant himself doesn't actually talk about this, right? But we see in his thought the sort of seeds that could lead us to that conclusion. And then lastly, we have the contractarian right to healthcare. So this is like Rawls, Hobbes, Rousseau, all those guys, like Locke, where we enter into contracts, and that's like where that's what justifies the authority of government, right? And that's what justifies like various moral claims, things that people would in principle consent to, right? Okay, so premise one, we choose to live together under a set of rules that we all consent to as a matter of mutual benefit. Okay, so we are willfully entering into a system where there are rules in place, right, where we're all benefiting from those rules. Two, hence, there's a conclusion, we therefore give up some of our freedoms for the goods of peace, security, and other advantages to society. So for instance, Locke wants to say is that in the state of nature, before we have any contracts, we all have absolute rights to everything, right? So I have a right to kill you, right? But the thing is, you and I get together and then we give up the right to kill each other. Does that make sense? We give up our rights to kill each other in order that we can like live and cooperate in peace, right? And so we give up a lot of freedoms to enter into society where we can trust one another and like cooperate together. So three, we can also demand certain protections and rights, since without them, the agreement doesn't make sense for all parties to enter into. So for instance, if we're writing up a contract, I say that I want the right to drive my car more quickly on the interstate than I do on like say a back road, right? I can demand that I have extra rights, right? And so similarly, premise 4 tells us that healthcare can be or should be one of those rights, where we say before we enter into the contract, we say, no, we all want the right to healthcare, and that's a plausible right that we should all have. And so it follows from that we have the right to healthcare, in fact, right? So this argument is really interesting, and once again shows us that a subset of philosophers, the social contract theorists, can get us to the conclusion that there's a right to healthcare. Okay, and that's all three of these arguments laid out together. And so as an objection, we may think that this is all just too demanding. So recall that Baumrin is constantly saying that, look, if there's a right to health care, we actually can't meet that right for everybody, right? It would be silly to think that we could just like totally and absolutely like get everybody enough health care, right? This is impossible. And because it's impossible, it follows that there is no right to health care, right? So we might think that maybe this is too demanding, in which case we could look at other countries that do acknowledge a right to health care, and we can see like, okay, are those systems functioning in those places as well? At any rate, so we've talked about why the history of Western thought gets us to the conclusion that there is, in fact, a right to health care. Thanks, everyone.